Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to film outside of the house on the eastern portion of the property with these beautiful mountains behind me. This is partly aesthetic and partly survival because lately the technical issues have been either a learning curve or spiritual in nature, but definitely have been having issues with blurry footage, disappearing audio, entire clips vanishing and corrupted. So this is a bit of a test on my end, and I'm not ruling anything out. If there are forces at play, perhaps a change of scenery will calm them down, or at least give them a better view. So here we go. Welcome to episode 4. In previous episodes, I introduced you to a strange house on a hill filled with the entire contents of another person's life. Bookshelves stacked with volumes on the occult, psychic phenomena, ritualistic magic, ancient symbols, politics, religion, Freemasons and the Illuminati. Some books even seem to predict aspects of our current political climate. Reality, folks, might be stranger than we think. I also shared my lifelong attraction to buildings that hold lingering histories, from owning the historic Huron substation in Los Angeles to accidentally giving birth to my son on the bathroom floor of Julia Child's childhood home, to the first house which I purchased, which had previously housed a gay adult film production company. And I introduced you to Falcon Man, an image, a guide, a messenger. Let me take you somewhere else for just a moment. That space between waking and dreaming, you know, the one where something appears and you're not entirely sure if it came from you. That's where he arrived. A man, but not exactly a man. A man with the body of a falcon, with wings and feathers that moved. Alive but not physical, I came to think of him as Falcon Man. He didn't introduce himself. No dramatic entrance. He simply appeared again and again and again. At the time, my life was very normal. Phone calls, contracts, masks, sanitizer, that whole chapter in our lives. Nothing mystical, nothing unusual, rather stressful. And at first I dismissed it because the mind does strange things. And then something happened. At that exact time, I was trying to buy this house. An offer had already been accepted from someone else. Everything was moving forward, and I felt unlucky, like I had missed it. And in my mind's eye, Falcon Man kept appearing. And every time he did, there was this quiet, persistent feeling that it was going to be okay. And then one day, after Falcon Man came to me again in a vision, celebrating for me, with me, as if I had won something, and suddenly this most unusual place was mine. Now, maybe that was coincidence, but the timing makes you wonder, because this idea that we might know things before they happen appears here again and again. Premonition, intuition, psychic impressions. Can information reach us before it's supposed to? How did we get here? I think a part of this podcast is about returning to the wonder and curiosity and magic of childhood. Not because it no longer exists, because in our busy lives, we stop noticing it. In episode 1, I also shared my connection to Ray Bradbury through my friend Christopher Sladoff, who sculpted a statue inspired by Ray Bradbury's stories, The Illustrated Man and Father Electrico. Why bring Bradbury up again? Because his stories explored telepathy, psychic phenomena, UFOs, starting in the 1950s. And Bradbury believed deeply in intuition, in imagination as a kind of sensing mechanism, in the idea that human beings might perceive truths before they can explain them. And sitting here outside this house, I wonder, is that all that Falcon Man was? Imagination? Or is imagination itself something we don't fully understand? I'm going to start with a very personal story. A few years ago, when my father was dying, one day I decided to sit still and imagine what my father's experience of death might be. Was it simply to be lights out, or would he, like my mother, after she had an emergency surgery to save her life, woke up crying? And while she was in intense pain, she told me that her tears weren't about the pain and that she had had the most moving experience that felt so very real. You see, while she was being operated on, in her sleep, she felt she was being beckoned down a road by what she felt to be her ancestors. That her description alone brought tears to my eyes. So as I sat there and imagined my father's potential exit, I wondered if it would be a lonely experience, or would it be like something my mother experienced, or what you hear from near-death experiencers? Where and who would he feel a great sense of love coming at him? Would it be his father Anton or his mother Elsa beckoning him out of his body and into the light? As I sat there and tried to imagine what his experience would be, the idea of a realistic toy rabbit popped into my head, and I saw it being handed to him as he exited his body. I thought that seemed kind of funny, and the cute little rabbit didn't really match my father's vibe, if you will. He was a German organic chemist and most definitely an alpha male. On a whim, I decided to call him. I chose not to tell him that I was trying to imagine his dying moment. At the moment I called, he was in the car and put me on the car speaker so my sister and his girlfriend could hear me as well. I asked him if rabbits had any significance for him, and he seemed kind of annoyed by my question. But then, after a moment, he told us a story. And the story felt so human, so sweet. He mentioned that his grandmother Caroline had raised rabbits for food during the war. She was like the queen of rabbits in their little village of Bad Frankenhausen. It was the wartime, and they often had little food. But he helped his grandmother feed and care for these rabbits, and he absolutely loved those rabbits. So not only was that a surprise to hear in this conversation, but also that his grandmother's name was Caroline, which was my sister's name. None of us knew that she was named after anyone in the family. And indeed, my father spoke so highly of his grandmother in this conversation, it was clear that giving Caroline that name was important to him. So, in thinking of my father leaving this world, I had a kind of daydream that connected me with this theme of rabbits and his grandmother, which was clearly a very sentimental image. Somehow, this daydream called upon a symbol I had no way of knowing. Bradbury might have called it the fourth dimension of the human soul, a layer of perception. And now, in this next group of books from George's shelves, we seem to step fully into it. One of the books in George's collection is Remote Viewing Secrets by Joseph McMoneagle. McMoneagle was part of a U.S. Army intelligence program studying whether humans could perceive information across distance and even time without being physically present. And over time, he became one of the most accurate practitioners in the program, which raises a Fascinating possibility. What if the mind can access information beyond the present moment? Because if that's true, moments like the Falcon Man or the rabbit might not be random. A surprising book on George's shelf is Teleportation: The Impossible Leap by David Darling. Writers like Bradbury loved machines that did impossible things. Time machines, memory machines, devices that turned thought into reality. And teleportation is a fascinating concept because it asks a most unique question. If a human being can be broken down into information and reconstructed somewhere else, what happens to the self? Is the you that arrives still you, or a copy, or something new entirely? George, reading this, may not have been thinking about science fiction. He may have been thinking about death, because teleportation begins to sound like a metaphor. A body dissolves, information remains, and something somewhere reassembles. In some spiritual lines of thinking, death could be a kind of teleportation, a movement of consciousness from one place to another. In modern physics, there's something called quantum teleportation, where information about particles can be transmitted instantly across space. Not people, but information. There could be a philosophical question. If your entire body is just information arranged in atoms, could that information theoretically be transmitted? And if that's possible, then what exactly is the soul? George's next book seemed to push even deeper into that possibility. Now imagine that George was reading this book while also reading about religion, channeling, angels, and psychic communication. And the next books on George's shelf seemed to push even deeper into that reality. In Angels, an Endangered Species by Malcolm Godwin, can I just say that title alone is fascinating? Endangered. As if angels used to be everywhere and now they're disappearing. It implies that we're allowing them to die off due to neglect or an environmental dilemma, and calls up a vision of a drowning angel in a swamp with tin cans and plastic water bottles floating above it. In Angels, and Endangered Species, Godwin suggests that angels may not have vanished, only our ability to perceive them has. Godwin explores how angels appear across different religions and cultures. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and also in folklore, art, and mystical traditions. For thousands of years, people reported encounters with angels, guides, messengers, protectors. But those reports seemed to decline as the world became more scientific. Godwin asks an unusual question. Did angels disappear, or did our ability to perceive them disappear? Just a thought. But what if my visions of Falcon Man were simply a matter of opening a lens of perception? Maybe George was asking the same thing of himself, because the next books on his shelf suggest he believed humans might still be able to communicate beyond normal reality. Our next book on the shelf is Conversations with God, Writing as Receiving by Neil Donald Walsh. A man writing questions and receiving answers. Bradbury wrote in a way that sometimes felt like this. He described stories arriving fully formed, as if dictated by something just beyond conscious thought. Not God necessarily, but something, a current, a flow. Walsh simply gave that experience a name. And George, for reasons we can only guess, kept that book close. How can I assume this? Because these books are worn and slightly frayed, like a child's favorite stuffed animal, frayed from love and attention. If you're unfamiliar with it, the premise is extraordinary. Walsh claims he began writing questions to God in a notebook during a difficult period in his life. And then, according to him, God answered, not as a voice in the room, but as words that appeared in his mind as he wrote. The result became a series of books where God speaks conversationally about life, death, morality, and the nature of the universe. Some people see the books as spiritual revelations, others see them as psychological reflection. Either way, they ask a profound question. Can human consciousness connect to a larger intelligence? Which brings us to someone who spent decades doing exactly that, a man whose name appears more than once in George's library. Before I go into Edgar Cayce, I want to mention that there are various forms of prophecy. While Edgar Cayce knew he was seeing the future, there are other scenarios where creative output seems to unexpectedly envision surprising details about the future. For instance, the author, Morgan Robertson, wrote a novella in 1898 entitled Futility or the Sinking of the Titan. The novella is about an unsinkable luxury ship, the Titan, that sinks in April after hitting an iceberg. In hindsight, this seemed an obvious prophecy of the sinking of the Titanic only 14 years later. And in current culture, there are some interesting instances, such as some of the episodes from the TV series The Simpsons, which seem to prophesy the future, such as the one entitled Bart to the Future, season 11, episode 17, where Lisa Simpson travels to the future and becomes the first woman president after Trump, who left a big budget crisis in his wake. Of note, in the year 2000, the possibility of Donald Trump becoming president was a very, very obscure reality. Also, they predicted 2 Nobel Prize winners and that the US curling team would play against Sweden in the Olympics and win. Okay, so let's return to Edgar Cayce, who is often referred to as the sleeping prophet. There are 7 books on George's shelves about Edgar Cayce. Cayce lived from 1877 to 1945 and became famous for entering trance states, aka sleeping, where he answered questions about health, reincarnation, the future, and spirituality. George owned books about Cayce's visions of Jesus and the higher self, including works by Geoffrey First and Henry Reed. Cayce believed that consciousness was not only confined to the body, that it could travel, access, retrieve, which begins to echo teleportation and remote viewing. Cayce believed that every human being had access to something called the higher self, a deeper level of consciousness connected to divine intelligence. He also made predictions about the future. Some were vague, some were wrong, some were surprisingly specific. For example, Cayce spoke about a period in the future where humanity would face enormous social change, environmental challenges, and spiritual questioning. A time when technology would advance quickly, but people would feel disconnected from meaning. That description feels uncomfortably familiar. Bradbury wrote about similar worlds, not as prophecy, but perhaps as a warning, which raises the question, are these ideas predictions? Was Cayce predicting our current moment? Or was he describing something that happens in every era when societies change? Either way, George clearly found Cayce important. But Cayce wasn't the only voice in George's library claiming to speak from somewhere beyond ordinary reality. In Seth Speaks by Jane Roberts, a voice emerges without a body. In the 1960s, Roberts began channeling an entity named Seth during trance sessions. Her partner recorded everything. Seth claimed to be a non-physical intelligence explaining the nature of reality. Explaining reality, expanding upon it, undoing it. Seth claims consciousness creates the world. Bradbury might not have said that literally, but he understood something close. That what we imagine shapes what we see, and what we see shapes what becomes real. George's library keeps returning to this idea from different angles, different voices, the same question. According to Seth, consciousness creates reality. Human beings exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and death is not an ending, but a transition. Sound familiar? It echoes ideas from teleportation, angels, and Casey's higher self, which suggests George might have been exploring a very specific idea that consciousness might exist independently of the body. George had numerous books on how to access your psychic capabilities and develop them. Many of them talk about how to go into a state and meet your spirit guides. And so we return to Falcon Man, to that moment before the deal collapsed. Was it intuition, pattern recognition, a subconscious calculation, or something else? Could that have been George guiding me to purchase this property? Bradbury once encountered a Mr. Electrico at a carnival who told him, "Live forever." A simple phrase, but Bradbury believed it changed the course of his life. A moment of contact, a transmission, a spark. Maybe that's all any of this is. Small moments where something passes between worlds. Not enough to prove, but enough to notice. When you step back and look at these books together, a pattern appears: teleportation, angels, conversations with God, channeling, remote viewing. Each one explores a slightly different version of the same question. What is consciousness, and what happens to the body when it dies? Many hospice workers report something curious. People approaching death often become intensely interested in spiritual or psychic subjects, and they often see relatives who have passed in their room or in their dreams. And experiences involving near-death visions, communication with loved ones, or encounters with unseen presences. Was George reading these books because he was curious or because he sensed something approaching? George was dying. Was George facing death and trying to see an existence beyond physical life? Because the deeper we go into George's library, the stranger it becomes. And the more I wonder, was George studying these ideas, or was the concept of psychic phenomena and parapsychology related to a UFO experience? So this area, Ventura County, has more sightings than almost anywhere in the world, if you include underwater submersible objects. One of our next episodes is about UFOs, UAPs, and the paranormal. In researching these topics, I came upon an odd revelation: that it is heavily reported by even the Pentagon's landmark study of UFO events, UAP intrusions onto US military bases, and the plethora of bizarre phenomena that happened at Skinwalker Ranch, that experiencers of these phenomena began to have what some refer to as the hitchhiker's effect. They've not only experienced some health issues, but many of them have started having paranormal experiences after a sighting, which have included seeing orbs, strange synchronicities, and experiencing telepathic communication. Do you hear that sound? That means it's time to end episode 4.
Hey everyone, thank you for watching. So I think recording outside worked out really well. While it looks kind of earthy and raw, there are very few technical issues, and that's a big woohoo. Not a woo-woo, but a woohoo. If you have a moment, please like and subscribe if you like what you see. It really helps the show out, and I so appreciate it. In our next episode of I'm Curious About George, we'll begin to explore some of the paranormal experiences associated with the house. Actually, just this past week, I had some guests over, and I was telling them a story about being ghosted by someone. And the second I said the word ghost, an onion that was sitting in a basket flew off the counter and landed on the floor. to all our surprise. And clearly, we were really surprised. And I wasn't even talking about ghosts. Maybe this entity should look up in the dictionary what the word ghosted means. After the paranormal episode, we'll go down the UFO rabbit hole, which is also incredibly fascinating. Hold on, folks, we're building momentum, and there's still so much to explore. So many questions still need to be answered about this library, about the strange possibility that the collection of books and objects and things happening here might be mapping out the story of the final questions of a person's life. Questions about consciousness, about death, and what, if anything, is on the other side. Until next time, I'm still curious about George.